Okay, welcome everyone. I'm very excited about today's discussion. We have with us today the very famous 4156 and has been famous in a variety of different contexts. He was an incredible collector. He is now a builder, and we're going to talk a little bit both about his journey from one area to the next area, but then the part that I think we're really going to dig into 4156 is a deep thinker about how NFTs are going to work over the long run and has some very distinctive and strong views about what is going to make for successful NFT collections. So we're going to dig into those and hit upon, I think, some real structural issues and his views on those structural issues. So first, I'd love to welcome him to the course. Very much appreciate the time he's taking with us today. And before we get into any of these complicated issues, I'd love it if you could just share with us a little bit your background and pathway in crypto and NFTs, and how did we end up where we are today in your life? Like, what was that journey? What was that pathway? Take us from the beginning to the present day, and then we'll get into more of the conceptual issues.
Yeah, sure, absolutely, and thanks a lot for having me. This is a really fun and interesting initiative, and really happy to participate. So I've been in the crypto space since about 2013. Around that time, I was working at like a Y Combinator startup. I had kind of previous to that had this kind of very mixed background where I was doing kind of more creative work, and realized it wasn't super efficient back then at paying the bills, and thought that maybe learning about financial markets would be kind of a valuable way to do that. And then I ended up, I guess, I guess have a tendency to become kind of obsessed with things. So I became, very obsessed with traditional financial markets. In addition to the kind of creative pursuits that I was undertaking, and spent a lot of time learning to invest successfully. So at the time, when I was working in a sort of creative capacity at this startup, I learned about Bitcoin. I think I read the white paper somewhere around. I think it was like the end of 2013, I believe. And I think I had to read through it a few times, but when it clicked, I think that it was in this sort of like meeting place in my kind of creative and finance brain. And I just became completely obsessed with it. Recognized immediately its sort of potential to change the world. Ended up buying a bunch of bitcoins, and then when the sort of first Bitcoin bubble happened, very shortly after that, I decided I was just gonna leave my job and just kind of use the bit of capital that I had to start building things on Bitcoin and blockchains. And that was sort of like the genesis of my journey. So I've been in the space since then, kind of working in various capacities on different kinds of projects. Some bootstrapped, some venture funded. Some were successful, some weren't. And after I guess a period of kind of relative quiet, I was kind of rediscovering some sort of creative pursuits, and kind of started thinking about NFTs a little bit more, and kind of fell down that rabbit hole. I would say that it was probably my sort of third kind of crypto rabbit hole after becoming obsessed with Bitcoin and Ethereum. And again, it really sort of spoke to the creative parts of my brain, and kind of discovered CryptoPunks, and very quickly sort of acquired a lot of conviction that these were going to be important, and that we had always sort of thought in the crypto space that the things that would make it go mainstream were sort of these like financial applications like payments, and very quickly after kind of discovering NFTs, I think I started to understand that the application layer might be cultural rather than financial. And yeah, as I sort of developed more conviction around that idea, and it ended up purchasing Punk 4156. So kind of very quickly acquired this conviction that NFTs were going to be important, and decided to take the leap and buy a CryptoPunk. And my original thesis was that it would be a really cool idea to buy a punk and kind of like build a brand around it. My original kind of plan or intent was that 4156 was going to be a sort of artist of its own within the NFT space. And this was kind of preliminary, maybe a bit kind of naive thinking, but I was thinking that the punk would like mint its own NFTs about bananas, and just kind of do silly sort of like absurdist art around this idea. And then kind of after getting deeper into the space, I kind of had this realization that collecting other work from other artists who were kind of much more accomplished and up to some very interesting stuff might be a kind of more interesting pursuit. Again, we can get into the kind of later realizations. I think that ended up kind of leading me to sell the punk and start working on Nouns. But I think those are kind of related to other questions. So yeah, the initial kind of run up into the space was, again, kind of having this hybrid kind of creative and finance background, and going through these kind of long periods of building and sort of obsession with different parts of the crypto technology stack, with this more recent realization that NFTs were probably one of the most important developments so far, insofar as they sort of represent the application layer and the way an awful lot of people get onboarded into this tech.
Okay, well, I think this is a great background, and let's start with actually Punk 4156, because I had mentioned this in my presentation a couple of days ago. The CryptoPunks, I don't think when they were launched were thought of as PFPs per se. Right? I think they were somewhere between collectible, art, fun, crypto native thing. And I'm not saying that they were not used as PFPs by anyone before G Money and you, but I've been in crypto since 2013, so I think I read the white paper 3 or 4 months before you, so I think we're in the same crypto class. And it was very, very clear to me when this idea of a punk as a PFP entered my radar screen, and it was first with G Money, I think it was in January 2021, and you in February of 2021, if I'm not mistaken. And let's dig in a little bit to this concept of a PFP as an identity, how it's how you thought of it, why you thought this would be a good idea, and where are you mentally now about the idea of a PFP as an identity? Is this something people are going to do? Is this something people are going to stick with one? Are they going to use different ones? How does that play out, do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I had originally also claimed some CryptoPunks, on the day they were launched. Just claimed a handful of them because, again, kind of early in the history of the space, there just wasn't that much to do, and it was kind of seemed interesting. And I claimed a bunch of them, and never really thought about them. So I think for me, it was also like kind of developing the thesis that you could build an identity around this, came much later than the realization that it was something you could own, or that it might be interesting to own. If I think back to the time when they were launched, I do think kind of initially there were a handful of people that were using them as their PFPs, or certainly there was another project, and I can't even remember if this was like a blockchain project or not, but there was a project called 8bit.me, I think, around that time, where people were using the the characters as their PFPs. So I think this idea was sort of in the air. I think at a certain point, kind of experimenting with Urbit, I had this idea that you could take like the Urbit ID and like build a Twitter account around the Urbit ID. So I think all these ideas were sort of in the air, and it just took a handful of us to actually start doing it and like doing it with conviction for it to become very, very popular. As with any sort of important trend, it's like in the absence of the people that did it, other people would have done it, and it would have happened anyway. So there is something sort of inherent in the medium, or like inherent in the nature of what kind of NFTs are and PFPs are that like makes all of this make sense. And I don't know exactly what it is, but it certainly seems to feel right. Certainly, to the extent that people don't just want to be themselves online; they want to be a character, and to the extent that it's kind of interesting and fun that being a character in the context of like a community of fixed size where other people also want to be similar characters but not exactly the same character, that's a lot of fun. And then also this idea that what NFTs are like, maybe they're this thing that is sort of able to soak up or capture all sorts of kind of cultural value that other financial assets can't, and that all of the things that you do online could sort of like accrue value to this sort of like cultural value sink. All of these things kind of mixed up together make it just very interesting and fun and kind of intuitive to use these things as PFPs. So I don't think it's just like a short-term trend. I do think it's here to stay. And I don't think there's, as with most kind of sustainable trends, there's not just one reason for doing it. There's kind of lots of reasons for doing it that are all mixed up together.
Okay, so then in the few months after that, I think there are a couple of episodes that stick in my mind where I think you were very vocal about a certain point of view. And in both cases, but certainly in the first case, you weren't completely alone, but you were more on the alone side than not on the alone side. I think the first case was when the crypto funks came out. And for those in the audience who don't know this was someone who did a project and took all the crypto punks and flipped them facing those exact same punks, and they flipped them facing the other way. And at least among some punk holders, this caused an uproar. They felt it would somehow hurt their punk, and I think a lot of pressure went on Larva Labs to do something about it, to file a DMCA or somehow take action against the funks. And I remember, because again, this was very obvious to me, you were very much against Larva Labs doing anything. And you were saying, like, this is silly. Why would you need to do anything? It's the token that matters. This is very silly. Tell us a little bit about that, because you were, I think, outside of the punks consensus and even Larva Labs consensus then.
Yeah, sure. And I think there were a few reasons for that as well. I think as someone who had been on the internet for a long time, and sort of really understood kind of the way memes and kind of culture flow on the internet, it just seemed logical to me that it would be a bad idea to kind of censor people who are kind of engaging in remix culture with a brand, right? Like that sort of fan culture, that sort of remix culture, I think historically has like supported the proliferation of things and supported the growth of things that would otherwise be obscure. So it seemed very counterintuitive to me that you would want to censor it. It was also the case, and we can get more into this if you want, but it was also the case that I was never really sure if CryptoPunks were a sort of like I always thought that they were a work of genius. I was never really sure if they were kind of like an intentional or accidental work of genius. And I sort of took the the act of censorship as like a little bit of evidence. I think at that time that it might have been a bit more accidental. Again, and that's not at all to sort of like discredit the invention and discredit Larva Labs and what they created, but more to say that maybe they didn't necessarily fully comprehend that thing that they had created in the way that some people who are a bit more crypto native might have. And I sort of took this to be like a little bit of evidence that maybe as like a company or a group, they weren't quite as kind of like aligned with the crypto ethos as I thought they were. And so I think I started speaking out of a combination of like trying to advocate for the thing that would create the maximum amount of value for punks, and then also out of concern that the stewards of this brand might be a little bit out of touch with the ethos of the space.
Right. So I think that's a great follow-on to what happened next. I think you were pushing for Larva Labs to have more permissive licensing. Back then, their approach on licensing was at best unclear, and I think most people thought maybe you could use it up to $100,000 per year of earnings, and the Meebits license seemed to emphasize something similar, so it was quite restrictive by what is now the current standards. And you were pushing for this model. There wasn't much of a response, and then you very famously sold 4156, which I think was shocking to people. What was the logic there?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think all of this was kind of against a backdrop of just kind of developing a thesis over time, and I think it had started kind of significantly before that. It actually, I think it started like a day or two after I bought 4156, because when I bought 4156, I never really thought about sort of like the copyright implications of trying to use 4156 as like a personality or an artist or a character. And a couple days later, I thought, I wonder what is the license on this thing that I bought. And so I started Googling it, and Google returned this article that I think had been kind of co-created by Larva Labs and a prominent law firm. I assumed it was their law firm at the time, that talked about it was a blog post that detailed like the order of operations to create a license that could be transferable with an NFT. So I read this, and with the understanding that it came from Larva Labs' own firm, believed that they must have a pretty liberal stance towards copyright if they're kind of co-publishing this sort of thought leadership with their lawyers. So I guess it's probably fine to do my own thing. And so I started doing my own thing, and I had kind of DM'd the founders on a couple of occasions just to confirm that their stance was sort of as liberal as that blog post kind of made it seem, and they just never responded. And so like kind of as time went on, and they were doing things like DMCAing funks, I started to worry a lot about worry about my specific kind of situation where I was starting to like build a brand around this thing, and maybe I didn't own this thing, but then more generally, again, kind of worry about did they actually understand what was happening in the community? Because if like the whole thing that the community was doing was sort of like engaging in using these characters as their PFPs, and kind of experimenting with building brands and personalities around them, and again using the sort of NFT as the sort of like syncing mechanism that like absorbs all of the activity that people are doing. Like nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to do that with something that they don't own in the long run, right? Like nobody wants to kind of invest all this time in a situation where they could easily sort of be rugged by the creators at some point in the future. And so I started to worry about it both in terms of my own situation, but then also in terms of like, is this thing as valuable as everybody thinks it is if people can't actually do the thing with it that they want to be doing. Now, in hindsight, it seems a bit less obvious because I think after this conversation took place, the narrative sort of shifted, as it has happened in crypto on other occasions with Bitcoin going from, being a payments mechanism to digital gold. I think, punks went from things that like people were using to represent their identity on some level to like, the narrative, the community changed the narrative to then kind of identify them as these historical artifacts, right? Where like, the token was the only thing that mattered and copyright wouldn't matter. But, I sort of disagreed with that stance. And I just thought it just does not make sense to continue to build a brand around something that I probably don't own. And, this thing is very valuable and I can use the capital for other things. So, I made, I think at the time what felt like a very hard decision, but I think ultimately the correct decision to sell the punk and focus on other things.
And so a few months after you did that, and was for sure a bigger shock to everyone, Larva Labs then sold the IP to Yuga, which then proceeded to put in a much more permissive license, a commercial rights license. And this caused, I think it's fair to say, all types of mixed feelings among the punks holders. And my take on it, which I don't know, it might be right, it might be wrong, I don't know. My take on it was objectively the license is better, it's more permissive, it's more crypto native than it was before. That part's clear. But somehow the act of seeing the IP being sold maybe shattered some views, illusions, I don't know, that people had previously about how Larva Labs viewed the punks. And even though objectively the punk owners had a better deal than they did 10 minutes earlier, a lot of them felt worse about it. How do you see? I mean, you were somewhat on the outside now, but what are your views on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when that happened, it sort of confirmed a lot of my fears. So I mean, I think the reason that there are sort of like there was a bad feeling around that is that again that this sort of these brands are built by communities, right? Like the punks IP is valuable because the community made it that way, because people like G Money and me and lots of others kind of spent a lot of time kind of like turning our punks into characters and kind of proliferating awareness about them, and then to see that kind of monetized by the creators without any real sort of meaningful value flowing back to the community, I think that it sort of points out the kind of misalignment of incentives that was taking place there. I also think, and again, I tend to be kind of like a lot more purist and kind of extreme in my views than a lot of people. So, take this for what it's worth. But like, I don't think that a commercial license necessarily solves the problem. I don't think that I don't think the commercial license necessarily solves the problem, because I think it's the case that like no matter how permissive that license is, it's the fact that it's revocable that will cause people to not make that kind of deep and fundamental investment into building up the character or building up the brand. Like I think no real serious entrepreneur is going to ever consider putting in 5 years, 10 years, whatever it takes to like really build something meaningful, when it's always the case that someone can pull the rug and say, hey, by the way, that thing you built, the IP's been transferred to yet another corporation, and they don't want these things to have commercial licenses, or we don't like the sort of business that you're building. So I think the thing that the punks sort of received was kind of much lower in value than the thing that they saw kind of Larva Labs receiving, based off of the community's hard work, and that that's sort of the reason that it didn't feel as good as one might think it would intuitively.
Yep, okay. I think that part's clear. And before we go to nouns, which is, I think, the logical next step, I want to take a sidetrack on something else, because if we don't do it now, I think I'm going to forget. You were also, if you asked me a year and a half ago, what thoughts come to mind about you, one was the Punk 4156, but the other thing was that you are a very vocal X copy collector. I just wanted to take, it's kind of a side path here, but take 2 or 3 minutes to share your thoughts about X copy. You own some amazing X copies. You own a lot of X copies. You are very vocal about it. X copy also now has CC'd Zero his work. So where's the 4156U now on X copy?
Yeah, sure. And I think again, this is like sort of interesting and maybe evidence that all of this stuff is kind of mixed up together, and you really have to kind of tease out the different parts of it. But like at the time I sold the punks and kept the X copy, both punks and X copy were we're not CC0, and my thesis around selling the punk and keeping the X copy was that X copy was kind of more quote unquote crypto native than Larva Labs, and that it would probably be the case that the work would eventually become CC0. I mean, also it was the case that the kind of the premise of ownership was not based around the sort of like avatar PFP movement and people sort of like creating things around their personas, and so it seemed like the commercial rights kind of mattered less for X copy, and so yeah, I think I feel sort of validated there in the sense that after the sale, Larva transferred the IP to Yuga, and X copy kind of CC zeroed all of their work. So that felt good. But in terms of just like the kind of like pure value of the X copy ownership, I think in most fields, and I think especially early on in most fields, you have these kind of like outlier performers, and it's my view that X copy is one of these kind of outliers in the context of crypto art. I think there's like a very sort of large gap between X copy and second place, whoever that might be. I don't have an opinion, but I think certainly like if there's anyone to have like a thesis around with respect to crypto art, I think it's X copy. I think the work, I mean, aesthetically it's incredible. He's clearly they're clearly a master of their craft. The work itself, I think, is very interesting in the sense that it sort of like talks about crypto history, and it kind of like references crypto history in a way that kind of like proves X copy's crypto nativeness. And I think it's also the case that these NFT timestamps sort of matter. And again, this is a whole other kind of field or a whole other subject to get into. But like if the things that sort of matter with respect to like crypto art are kind of like timestamps and aesthetic and provenance, like X copy has all three kind of in a way that no other artist does, right? Like the work is stunning, the work is very, very early, and the work is kind of like about the movement and kind of native to the movement in a way that almost nothing else is. So I just think it's like it's a very, very obvious, like if you have a thesis with respect to crypto art, X copy is like the purest and highest quality way to kind of express that thesis, and they're just super cool to own, and yeah, just everything about it is just very, very interesting in my opinion.
Okay, so I mean, you're not going to get any objection to me from me about X copy. I agree completely with everything you said. Two interesting points I want to tease out from there, and one, I think it's clear given your thesis on why owning the IP is important. PFPs really do gain value from the activity of the community, whereas an X copy less so. Now, it's still probably better, I think, in your view, putting words in your mouth, that it is CC0 because there'll be derivatives, will get more attention, what have you. But it is less if you own a certain X copy, you and your personal activities are likely to add less value to it than if you owned a certain PFP. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think so. Like if like and I actually I don't know for sure. Like it could be possible that all of this is the same thing, and you know we're just talking about like very small nuances. But like you know intuitively, it feels like if I set my PFP to the Mona Lisa, my activities are going to have very little impact on the Mona Lisa. I suppose you could argue to the extent that there's only a small handful of people in the world that know Xcopy that you know if I set my PFP to like this is clearly money laundering or right click save guy and you know was like a famous character that was kind of like you know identifying as that thing um, that actually it it could kind of operate the same way as it does in the PFP universe, but I think maybe the distinction is that like um, in the PFP universe, like it doesn't really feel like anybody is sort of like competing around the same piece, right? Like there's the reason that there's 10,000 CryptoPunks and there's only one right click save guy. Well, actually, not the reason that's true, but the consequence of that is that like a community of 10,000 people can form and like each one can each individual in the community can kind of like inhabit one of the 10,000, but you know there's only one right click save guy, and so there's like maybe an unnatural amount of competition that would emerge if everybody wanted to kind of inhabit that identity. So I don't know. There's some sort of like cultural difference, I guess, even if mechanically all of these things work the same way. There's like a cultural difference around the PFPs versus the sort of canonical works of crypto art and how people want to use them.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And I want to go to the timestamp issue because this is one where I think your view is what's generally believed. It's what I think I believe. That early crypto timestamps are important. But let me make the opposite case for a second. If I think about major art movements, any of them, like literally any major art movement the last few hundred years, nobody cares what specific date the first piece of fill in your favorite art movement, right, was made, right? I mean, I don't even, people maybe talk within decades. They certainly, I don't think, talk within like days or months. And the pieces that you remember, the pieces that have become important, often come later in an artist's career. Take Picasso. Picasso's most famous work was not his earliest work. His earliest work is interesting historically, what have you, but if someone was going to pick the Picasso, you could pick only one Picasso and you could put it in your museum. You wouldn't go to young Picasso and take the first painting he made, right? How do we reconcile those two, or is it different with a blockchain?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different with a blockchain because like those artistic movements weren't kind of built on top of time stamping machines, right? Like it's related to the medium, I think, that the timestamps become more important in crypto art than in traditional art. Um, I think it's just kind of like a fundamental property of the medium. And again, I'm not saying that like timestamp is the only thing that's important. You know, I think there's probably a Venn diagram and you know maybe in the context of crypto art, like the timestamp circle is just like much larger than it is in than in traditional art. Um, I think like one way you can think about this that I mean, and again, I don't know if this is right. This is just kind of a crazy way that I think about it. Is like if you look at NFTs as currencies, right, as social currencies, and every artist is kind of creating their own currency. You know, there is a sense in which the kind of aggregate supply is unbounded, right, and the market will have to make decisions about you know which ones are valuable and which ones aren't. And again, like looking at the movement and looking at the culture, you can reference something like Bitcoin, which we all know is sort of like obsessed with this 21 million coin limit. If you look at NFTs, I believe it's like only very recently have there been kind of 21 million ERC 721s created, and the number of NFTs that are created is kind of increasing kind of exponentially with adoption and interest in the technology. So you have this like very obvious kind of like curve in the NFT kind of money supply creation, right? That the kind of hockey stick shaped growth that you see in as most technologies are adopted, and I think that curve makes like for a very interesting kind of thesis around collecting, right? That like in the early history of the space, this currency was much more scarce, and if the timestamps matter, like old timestamps are more scarce than new timestamps, and I don't think we have that sense when we think about paintings, right? We don't think about like the exponential growth of like canvases over time, and that we could like track that with 100% certainty using some sort of technology. But in the context of NFTs, we can do that. Now, whether people will do that, I don't know, but at minimum, it's a kind of interesting thesis to have, or interesting kind of angle to use to think about the tech.
Got it. Makes sense. Well, I guess this one we just won't know until the future, right? We're gonna have to like run the clock forward a few decades and then see how it plays out. It's compelling. It's compelling, but it will be different, I think, if it happens. Okay.
Agreed. One last point on that is like, I mean, someone could easily go and kind of model it today, right? Like there's probably some sort of like multifactorial analysis that you could use to kind of like cancel out the sort of like the provenance and aesthetic premiums, and like just look purely at timestamp and just see if this sort of curve is intact. And I mean, I would argue that like there in theory at least could be a lot of value in doing that, because you could run some sort of statistical arbitrage on timestamps. If the pattern is emerging, and then there are lots of kind of like outliers within the pattern.
Interesting. Well, if someone's listening and is good at math and good at reading data from a blockchain, there might be an interesting analysis to do there. Okay, let's go now to nouns, because I think given what has happened over the last 45 minutes, we can kind of see the pathway to where nouns came from. And let's start with describing your words, what the nouns are, what they're trying to accomplish, what are the design decisions that you made, and how that links to your thesis about what's going to work with NFTs in general or PFPs specifically.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. Yeah, so I mean, the kind of invention of nouns was in many ways a sort of reaction to, all of the kind of like emergent issues that I saw with CryptoPunks, and if I remember correctly, I sold 4156 after, kind of a while after I had already been kind of thinking about nouns. So, it wasn't necessarily that the reaction to this like came from disillusionment with punks. I'd been just starting to think about like, what could quote unquote punks 2.0 look like a while before that. And I thought I had kind of written down some interesting features that it might have. So, one of the issues that has been kind of present all through crypto history is this sort of idea of fair distribution, and just the large extent to which kind of being in the right place at the right time has kind of like influenced who ends up holding certain assets, and how that group ends up kind of using that luck in some ways to kind of like seek rent on future crypto participants. So I thought, well, one feature that this next version of punks, or however you want to think about it, should have is that the distribution should happen very, very slowly over time. And I thought it might be really, really interesting to start one of these collections with zero kind of zero money supply, zero instances, and then just have like a new one created every day forever. The forever part, if you kind of like kind of increase the money supply kind of slowly enough, then it could just be kind of perpetually inflationary, and anyone over any kind of period of crypto history would have, in some sense, like an equal opportunity to participate. So I thought that's kind of where one NFT every day forever came from. Then I started thinking about, well, like, if this project is like, if it is going to be forever, then maybe it should be like, what is the most extensive kind of, or what is the most extensible metaphor I can kind of come up with to create something that could have this kind of longevity. And that's what made me think about nouns. It's just so kind of not specific, right? You could kind of include anything in a collection that, it doesn't identify itself as punks or penguins. Like you could just include anything at all, and that might make it really fun. The next thing I thought about was the sort of the maybe little bit of a lack of coordination that existed within the punks community, and then also the fact that, like, the whole reason that people had kind of gotten together to kind of cheer these things on, like that it was mostly predicated on this idea that the price was going up, or the number was going up, and what might happen if that stopped. What would happen to kind of the culture if the only thing to do in the community was kind of like cheer on the price bubble. So then I thought about, well, maybe this sort of thing should instantiate a DAO, and then all of the NFTs can act as kind of governance tokens for controlling the organization. And then I thought, well, that actually works really well with this sort of like perpetually inflationary money supply, because in theory it would mean that the DAO could have this perpetual source of funding. And so I kind of wrote down all of these ideas, noodled them for a couple weeks, and then had this moment where I kind of composed them into a Twitter thread and just did this gut check of like, should I hit send or not? Is this something I want to build or not? And then I hit send on you can look on my Twitter and see I guess like the sort of de facto white paper that I wrote down for nouns. And at the end of it, I said, hey, does anyone want to work on this? And I think, it was very fortunate that at that moment, kind of in the history of the space, there were a lot of like really talented, interesting people around that were looking for something cool to work on. And a bunch of them reached out, and the rest was history. Over the next few months, we built what Nouns is today, and we launched it on August 8th.
So in addition to one noun a day, I think other interesting features of the nouns are that the money from the sales is not received by you or the team. It goes into some type of treasury, which we'll talk about. You and the team will receive an aggregate one in every 10 nouns for a period of time. The nouns are all CC0 in the public domain, and there are no royalties, right? And so this is quite a lot of different design decisions. And in aggregate, I think your logic on some of these, but I'd love to hear it, is that they will now allow the nouns or the nouns culture or token or what have you to spread further faster, right? Is that the logic?
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, thanks for filling in those details that I missed. That's right. Um, that I think one of the sort of central part of my central thesis around CC0 is that kind of copies make originals more valuable, right? If like ultimately the thing that is valuable here is the token, is this kind of thing that we can we can point to the blockchain and we can prove that beyond a doubt this is the original instance of a noun, that you no longer need in that context to kind of defend how an image is used or how an image is proliferated. Just like we look at something like the original Mona Lisa, and it's famous because everybody knows what it is. It could be the case that you could have, if you own one of the very few original nouns, and everybody in the world knows what they are, that might make them more valuable. And so the sort of like one of the objectives of these communities, and I think there's lots of subtle reasons we can identify that they should have other objectives, but one of the objectives of these communities is the sort of like cultural proliferation of the meme, and yeah, a sort of set of initial conditions that let that proliferation happen as freely as possible, that subsidize that proliferation or kind of set it on a trajectory to kind of happen as quickly as possible. That might be something that kind of creates value for the community.
Okay. Well, let's dig into some of these things. Let's say I don't own a noun, right? Because the nouns holders, how many nouns are there today?
Let's see, where are we today? Today is 484.
And I think there's some pretty big holders, right? So how many addresses hold a noun? Maybe a couple hundred, something like that.
Yeah, I think number of unique holders is about 50% of the total supply, I believe, somewhere around there.
Okay, so let's say a couple of hundred. So there's 8 billion people in the world, 200 own a noun. For the 7.999 billion people who don't own a noun, why should they go help the nouns become more valuable, which is the thesis?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think there's a few different things to talk about here, right? And I think the reason it's sort of like unintuitive to talk about these things is partly because of the kind of initial set of conventions that the NFT community has adopted. One of those conventions is that like NFT ownership is this kind of like one-to-one premise, right? Like you have one individual and one owner, right? That communities, for example, won't eventually own individual NFTs, which I think they will. So I think it's kind of a false premise in the first place to say that because there are only 400 nouns, there can only be 400 owners. I think in the very long term, it becomes actually much more interesting than 8 billion nouns if thousands and thousands of people are kind of not forced but like kind of encouraged by the protocol to kind of coordinate their ownership of a single noun and to operate that vote. So I think that's one way you can think about it. The other way you can think about it is that like if you look at kind of traditional brands, or sort of like traditional media properties, the kind of like the ownership of the IP and the sort of like fandom of the IP are rarely the same thing, right? Like every Mickey Mouse fan is not like an owner of Disney equity, right? There's kind of a relationship between owning the Disney equity and being a Mickey Mouse fan, which is like there's a sense in which owning the equity kind of like seeks rent on the fandom, but I think that can be very, very fluid, right? It's possible that people can be fans of nouns and fans of kind of like what the protocol gets up to without owning a noun. It's possible that they can kind of unlike the case of Disney, they can actually just use the IP and kind of monetize it for themselves, right? And in that sense, the IP sort of like seeks less rent on the fandom because the fans can just make their own merch and kind of make their own stuff. I hope in the long run, the sort of cost of ownership for kind of participating in ownership drop significantly, right? Such that a fan that has $5 could own like 0.0001% of a noun and consequently get to participate in kind of governance decisions around the protocol. So I think there's sort of a lot of subtleties here that will in the long run inform the relationship between ownership and fandom, and that these things are not as kind of like vanilla as the NFT space has led them has sort of led people to believe they are.
So, if that's the case, right, if people get together and buy a noun collectively, does it suggest that the nouns become more like general brands, less your identity, right? Because it seems hard to me. Let's say 10,000 people each chipped in $5 and we bought noun 3,272. I've very early on, I tried to see what it was like on the fractionalization side. I think I bought 60 ape tokens. One of the punk apes is fractionalized. And I'll be honest, I didn't feel the same connection as when I owned a punk directly, right? Like one I felt like I owned an identity. I had this sense of ownership when I owned an ERC20 token, a fungible token that was X% of a punk ape. Maybe it's a good investment, maybe it's a bad investment, but I certainly didn't have these identity feelings, right? And so, given how few nouns there are, given that you're saying people should or might collectively control them, does it mean that the nouns are less a PFP identity type NFT and something a little different? How should we think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think again, it kind of I think there's a sense in which the early history of the NFT space is probably responsible for the suboptimal experience that you had with the ape ownership. I think there are sort of much more interesting design decisions that can be made around collective ownership. If we just wanted to brainstorm a few with respect to nouns, like you could look at the noun that I have right now, and you could imagine that that it is sort of the PFP or the flag for a community, but that community members would have a certain freedom to kind of interpret how they relate to that flag, right? So maybe everyone in the community has the same glasses but a different head, or we all have the same shirts, or we all use the horse head and we dress it up differently. There's a kind of experimental protocol that's being built on top of nouns right now called composables, which kind of proposes building a kind of marketplace for traits for nouns, so that you could kind of apply those traits to the PFP. So I think that again, there's all sorts of room for nuance and for builders to create kind of interesting experiences around collective ownership. And I think a lot of those don't exist today. So I do think ultimately it's just very interesting to think about a noun as representing a community rather than an individual, with kind of lots of room for individual expression, within the context of that community, or kind of within the context of the noun as the flag for the community.
Okay, see, this makes sense to me, and I think that was what I was trying to get at. That though, given the structure of nouns, specifically how few there are, right? There's just not that many nouns. It is what. So some people, some noun OGs in the future, there'll be noun OGs, might actually own a whole noun, right? Is that going to be a thing? Like, oh, I own a whole noun. It's like you own a whole Bitcoin, right? That type of logic. But many of them might be like a symbol for a guild or a community, something like that. Is that a good way to think about them?
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, I think there's very very little correlation between like whole numbers in the money supply and uh, like the cap of possible participants within a community. You know, this idea that these things are kind of like directly correlated. I do think it's like a product of just how early it is. You can certainly imagine in like it's hard to imagine creating like okay. So I would ask how could you if you wanted to create like one instance of an NFT for everyone in the world, you can't today create a kind of PFP collection, that like lets 8 billion people buy in. Nobody wants to kind of participate in a community at the moment where the money supply is that inflated. So I think you just have to think about like how would it be possible to scale any one of these communities to kind of maximize participation and also just have like a sort of sane money supply. And I think like the only reasonable answer is that over time, people will have to kind of figure out how to divide up the money supply such that more and more people can participate.
Okay, I think that's clear. Let's talk about royalties because that is a very hot topic today. And the space is divided, I think. Um, some exchanges have said, look, we're not going to honor artist royalties or we'll make it optional, which I think is more or less the same thing. Some, I think, longtime crypto people say, like, well, yeah, this is obvious. Of course, this is how it's going to end up. Like, anything else is naive. Some artists saying, well, this is kind of ridiculous. Like, part of what I signed up for when I minted this piece was I'm minting it at this price, and this is the expectation. This was that the royalty was part of that price. It was part of the deal. And then I guess there's this third point of view that is kind of mine. It's not technical, but it would be kind of weird to say, like, hey, you can do whatever we want on Ethereum, but the only thing we can't do is have a royalty, right? Like, it seems conceptually weird for a permissionless system, right? And leave aside the technical issues, right? It's not a technical question. It's kind of a philosophical question. Where are you on this, right? Where are you on this topic? Obviously, nouns do not have royalties. How do you feel about royalties in general? Is it different for PFPs? Is it different for one of one art? Is it anyway? Are they anyway doomed? Should people think about organizing themselves not to expect royalties? What's your view?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, obviously, it's a very kind of controversial topic, and maybe rightly so because people have this idea that their kind of future earning power is kind of like wrapped up in their ability to collect royalties. So I respect that the conversation gets very heated when discussing it. I try to take like maybe like a sort of first principles approach in thinking about it. And the way I think about it is that like artists or kind of NFT creators, if you start from the premise that these are kind of social tokens, right? Artists and kind of creators of NFTs, minters of NFTs, already just have a tremendous kind of amount of kind of power in the relationship between artist and collector, or minter and owner, that never existed before. And that power is that they have the final say over the money supply. Now, I mean, you can kind of carve out things like nouns where we try to kind of get around that problem by making the sort of money supply algorithmic. But like I think the most interesting conversation about royalties is around kind of individual creators, right, and their relationship with royalties. And so I think what's kind of misunderstood with respect to this topic is just like how much power artists have with respect to the money supply, right? They can create a new piece and inflate the money supply kind of arbitrarily at any time. If the thing that is being kind of purchased by collectors is provenance, it doesn't matter if the piece is in the same collection as the last collection, that if it's the artist's first token or 70th token, like none of that matters. The point is that sort of every time that kind of creator creates new work, they're kind of inflating the money supply of the social token, and that gives them just a tremendous amount of kind of leverage and frankly earning power, right? That in my view means that they shouldn't also need to sort of tax the transactions that happen within their own economy. Um, and I think ultimately that's sort of what royalties are. In more practical terms, I think royalties are just kind of make for poor incentive alignment, because what they sort of incentivize for the artist is more volatility, because every time people want to buy and sell that artist's work, that artist collects a royalty. So like, in any one of these communities, the community, the kind of individuals that are collecting the royalty sort of benefit from volatility, and that doesn't seem like like a sustainable kind of long term trajectory. So I think like the fact that you can just like creators can create new work and sort of dilute the money supply at any time gives them a tremendous amount of earning power, and we've already seen evidence of that, right? Like some of these like Xcopy open editions. I believe was one of the art blocks creators recently. You know, uh, made like $12 million or something in a day by creating new work. I just don't see the need for kind of taxing the money supply as like an additional mechanism for income when it creates so many kind of undesirable effects.
Okay, so you're basically saying artists can monetize through additional primary sales. And then what would you say to an artist that said, well, look, you mentioned X copy, you mentioned Tyler Hobbs. Okay, fine. I mean, I'm pretty sure under all scenarios of any scenario of the world, X copy and Tyler Hobbs are, of course, perfectly capable of monetizing their reputation at any point in time because their reputation is stellar. They're the top of their field. But a lot of artists struggle to make primary sales, right? And they're saying, well, maybe this doesn't apply in the same way to me. How should they think about it? How should they organize themselves differently?
I mean, I think in a sense what we're saying here is that like successful people will make lots of money and unsuccessful people won't. Like I think like the sort of structure I described is like kind of holds in all cases, right? Like if you're successful at making primary sales, you would probably make a lot of royalties, and if you're unsuccessful at making primary sales, you probably also wouldn't make a lot of royalties. I think the reality is that this is the cost of producing NFTs is very low. It is a very very competitive marketplace, and it's an entrepreneurial marketplace. Just like YouTube was and is, just like a lot of other sorts of markets are, and I think it's a sad reality, but the fact is that not everyone's going to make it. The people that do make it, if those people that do make it could monetize with royalties, they can also monetize with primary sales, and I think they can do that better. And if you can't make it with primary sales, it seems very unlikely to me that royalties would help. The only scenario that this actually captures is the scenario where you, like for example, you create a lot of early work, and then for some reason you're unable to produce additional work, and people discover your early work and it becomes tremendously valuable, and you sort of have no way to kind of monetize what you did in the past. I mean, the way to defend against that is sort of like keep some NFTs for yourself. Um, that's one possible solution, but the royalties in this case really cover just a very narrow set of circumstances that I don't think like everyone on average should be designing for.
Okay, makes perfect sense. Let me ask you, you mentioned the word social token, sometimes social currency. What do you mean by that?
I mean, I think largely that's what NFTs are. They, again, all of this is sort of happening in the context of blockchains, in the context of like the world kind of moving from governments having a monopoly on money to kind of individuals and kind of entrepreneurs and communities being able to create their own currencies. And I think there's a very real sense in which, these kind of one of ones that these are kind of artist currencies or social currencies for individuals. And there's lots of evidence for this, right? Like if you look at the sort of like correlation between kind of social media success and kind of NFT value, I think it's kind of evidence that what is being bought and sold in a sense is attention, and attention kind of as it relates to an individual. So I do think that's a reasonably good model for looking at what is happening in the space. We're moving from a world where governments create currencies that kind of look and act like pretty boring sort of objects, and artists are creating currencies that look and act in much more interesting ways. And there's some small level of adoption happening where people are willing to kind of use these as stores of value, and use them to transact, and use them to do social signaling and all sorts of other things. And that's really, to a large extent, what we're witnessing in the NFT space.
So I was having this discussion with Vincent Van Doe, and he had the following concern about this terminology. And under a norm, it's very clear that if you make a piece of one art, which a lot of what artists think they're doing, right? They're making a one of one art. This is not anything that has any regulatory implications, right? Like it's protected by the First Amendment. It's obviously not a security. X copy makes a piece of digital art, mints it. This is no different than someone minting, painting a painting and selling it. No one has ever crossed their mind that these things might be securities. If we start saying, oh, they're currencies, they're competing with other currencies or financial instruments, what have you, do we risk either mischaracterizing them to our detriment, or people start doing things with them that then end up edging more towards the regulated financial services side of crypto, and all of a sudden something that, as far as I can tell, should have there are no regulatory implications for an artist minting a photograph, right? If they're doing a social currency and do, I don't know what it would be, something that looks more like an American security, all of a sudden we get back into the world of registration and SEC and what have you. What's your view on this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have a super strong view because I just don't have a lot of expertise in that domain. I would like my intuition is that one, like what we call them doesn't really matter. In the long run, they either are or they're not securities, financial assets, whatever. I mean, I think outside of the uh, outside of the context of like how regulators look at them, I think that they are completely new things, that have properties of many different things, and that it's generally overly simplistic to think of them as A or B or X or Y. Like there are many things simultaneously, and that's what makes them interesting. I also think the sort of long-term trajectory of this space is probably some sort of like revolutionary type confrontation with regulators, with governments, because it just seems inevitable to me that that one of the most powerful things that the technology does is it kind of democratizes the ability to create currency, and when that kind of butts up against the government's sort of ability to monopolize currency, that it's going to be confrontational. So I think that sort of confrontation is inevitable no matter what we call these things. And we should do them the service of naming them the thing that describes them best versus kind of trying to be dishonest about it for fear of how regulators will look at them. We've already seen sort of like the negative implications of that with respect to governance tokens and people being kind of intellectually dishonest about like what things are. So I think it's just good to call them what they are.
Okay. I think that's a fair question. A fair answer. Let me ask you this. It's 20 years from now. Nouns are right about minting noun, 7,300 or something, right? That's where we'll be in 20 years. In your best case outcome vision of what 20 years from now the future looks like for nouns, paint a picture. Where are we? What does it look like?
Yeah, so I think the most interesting case for nouns in the very long term is that they emerge as something like the first network state. Each noun becomes a very kind of large community of its own, and that the nouns DAO, the kind of organization that glues them all together, is the meta organization. It's kind of like the UN, or it's the body where they all kind of coordinate the activity between these very, very large internet communities. I think in that scenario, the treasury that these communities have access to is quite large, probably measured in the tens or hundreds of billions, and that this treasury can be used to kind of at this time go well beyond proliferating the meme and start being used to actually build public infrastructure, to build public goods. And we already do this at a very small scale, but I think there the optionality kind of exists within the structure for this to emerge. It's very early, and there's a lot of work that we have to do towards that goal. As with any sort of crypto, it's all very risky and novel, and there's lots of things that could go wrong on the way. But I think in the case where everything goes right, and in the case where the internet sort of continues to become more important, and blockchains kind of continue to become more important as the way we govern how the world works, I think it would be very, very interesting if nouns, or something like nouns, emerged as one of the key pieces of governance infrastructure and public goods funding, and that got linked back to the world and could do a whole bunch of good there. That's kind of the most exciting vision I can think of for the project.
You had tweeted something, I think, a few days ago, that every time someone talks about the book value of the treasury, you wanted to give $1 million of the treasury away, something along those lines. And now you're saying about the treasury being for public goods. How should noun holders think about the treasury? Is it something like it's an endowment of a not-for-profit and they need to be used just to promote nouns, and then in the long run other public goods? It's not, and by extension, it's not something to say, oh, look, we have this pile of ETH, let's pay ourselves a dividend. Is that what was implied in that book value tweet?
Yeah, I mean, I think on my Twitter and just generally, I'm very kind of public in kind of working through these problems in my own head. I don't know that this was any sort of definitive statement about how the treasury should be used. It was really just largely how I was feeling at the moment. That my personal sense, and again, I'm I guess there's a sense in which I'm maybe a spiritual leader of the community, but there's also a sense in which I can be very wrong, and I'm also my only kind of hard power here is the number of noun votes that I have, which is I'm not even close to the largest holder, and so I think in that moment I was feeling like as a community we had sort of stopped being as aggressive as we were with funding public goods and kind of funding charitable endeavors, which I think for a whole bunch of other reasons that we haven't discussed is like something that's very, very important for crypto and blockchains to do. So I was just kind of vocalizing, um, I guess maybe in the way I do sometimes, very strongly, my opinion that we could move back in that direction. Um, but I think it's ultimately up to all noun holders to kind of collectively figure out what it is the project should do. I think the thing that makes it interesting is that it's permissionless, and the thing that makes it interesting is that it's the competing visions of all the owners and all of the members, that determine what the organization will do. I think you can really think about the kind of disbursement of the treasury as sort of like a function, right? And that function, like the thing it reacts to is sort of like the overlapping areas of all of the Venn diagrams of all of the owners and what they want to do. There's that space in the middle where we all agree that this is something valuable, and the treasury is like a function that executes that thing. So I mean, I think that's probably the right way to think about it long term. And then I continue to kind of inject my opinions as they kind of form.
Okay, and then I think not exactly related, but sort of related. You're in the process, or I guess it has been decided, to do something that I believe to most projects would be inconceivable, which is you're going to delete the Discord. And the logic, if I understood it correctly, was two two theories. One theory is in time, if Nouns becomes super successful, that official Discord is going to be very powerful ground. I guess like kind of what happened with Bitcoin.com and the
Yeah,
Bitcoin area.
our
And so,
Bitcoin. Yeah.
right, and so it's going to be fought in our Bitcoin, and it's going to be fought over, and maybe not in a way that aligns with the overall project, who gets to run that Discord, what views happen in that Discord. And then you also said something that like the mix of people who were involved for culture and development versus for financial purposes. In a way, the Discord management is a subsidy from those involved in the culture and operations to those who are just in it for a financial return. How should we think about that? And I guess the Discord is going away. Has the decision been made?
Yeah, that's right. So Halloween, October 31st, will be the last day of the quote unquote official Nouns Discord. And again, I think a lot of my public comments are me trying to work through a lot of these things in my head. I think the reality is that it as quote unquote neutral territory, it already was being fought over. It was being fought over in very subtle ways, but that I think that dynamic already did exist. And yeah, I think it was just ultimately something that again in these very nuanced ways was kind of unhealthy for the community and making it a less fun and productive place to be than it otherwise was and otherwise would be. And I think the fact is that there are already dozens, if not more, discussion forums where there's like very interesting and productive discussion that is taking place about nouns. And those spaces have points of view, and so they're not fought over, right? They don't pretend to be neutral, and it's just a much more healthy and productive thing for the community to kind of disperse into those spaces, and then ultimately for us to kind of come back and meet on chain, and really have our discussions about the governance of the protocol in a place where those discussions have like weight, where they have meaning, right? Where like in essence, these votes are a place where kind of like words and actions are the same thing, or these proposals are a place where words and actions are the same thing, and that is not necessarily happening in the Discord. I think if you sort of like just looked into the Discord and tried to take the temperature in there based on the discussion that was happening as to whether we should shut down the Discord or not, you would have had an intuitive sense that people were kind of overwhelmingly against it. But on the noun owners call when someone kind of like took the temperature of actual owners. I think the vote was it was a smaller call, but the vote was like something like 20-4 in favor of shutting it down. So again, this is the way in which the supposedly neutral space can become contested, right? And like obviously the people that kind of benefit the most from taking over that neutral space would be in favor of keeping it. And so you can see there's kind of hard evidence right there that this is an unhealthy kind of dynamic for the community. So I think it's ultimately a great thing that we're shutting it down. And I think ultimately if the protocol can't survive the end of a single Discord server, then it doesn't really deserve to survive. So I think it is quite robust in certain ways, and we're already seeing just like a lot of new Discords popping up and a lot of more interesting conversations happening. So I do think ultimately we'll look back and see that it was the right move.
Okay, because I've taken up a lot of your time, so I'm going to end with one question, which is, what's the question that I should have asked but didn't ask? What's the thing that you'd like to close with, and the thing that we didn't cover but I should have asked that we should have covered?
I'd say maybe just with respect to the CC0 stuff, like I think a lot of the conversation always kind of revolves around ownership and licenses and what's right and what's wrong. I think one of the things that's like really frequently neglected is just like how awesome remix culture is. But like certainly at the peak of like the NFT frenzy, people were just doing so many cool things with punks, like remixing them in all sorts of fun and interesting ways. And that remix culture in the Nouns community is super, super strong, and people are always making just like incredible things. And I think this sort of remix culture is just very, very native to the internet. It's just like it's a place where people want to take things and synthesize them and have fun with them and play with them and proliferate them. So I think maybe like the most important reason to be kind of bullish on CC0 is that NFTs actually allow this sort of remix culture to be monetized in ways that are going to produce like really, really fun and refreshing and great culture. So I think it's really important not to lose sight of that.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And in some ways, it's interesting, and we have just not gotten the story out as a field. The idea that a collector is willing to spend money to, in effect, keep artists working, and then also at the same time make that art available to the global public commons seems like literally the best case outcome for the world at large, right? Literally something that people should be very happy about. And that message hasn't gotten out. I mean, but people who are not into the NFT space, and sometimes they argue with me on Twitter, and I try to be helpful, and they say, well, I mean, just, you don't own anything, right? That's just the kind of thing. And kind of my view is like, what do you care? If I'm happy owning a token or a piece of art that's CC0, who's the victim here? I mean, the artist has gotten money for their work. Literally, the rest of the planet has this art to play with. And for some reason, a rich collector is the victim. Who's the actual victim? I'm the victim? I assure you I'm not the victim. And if I'm not the victim, who else is the victim of this? But people struggle with it, I think. And I think it doesn't mean all art should be CC0, right? Each artist should use whatever license they want, but CC0 art, I think, does have this dynamic that, in effect, everyone, I think, is winning. And I don't see who's possibly losing. And so we probably agree on this. Is that fair?
Yeah, I agree very strongly. I think one interesting way to frame it, and I think I have to run in a minute, so I don't have time to get into it. But I think the two of the killer apps of blockchains are NFTs and public goods, and the kind of the intersection between those things is just very, very fruitful space. And I think thinking about the CC0 conversation in that context is maybe a really nice way to think about it, and kind of leads you to a lot of these conclusions.
Okay, well, thank you again so much for your time. This was excellent, and look forward to seeing what happens in the Nouns ecosystem as things evolve.
Yeah, thank you, and really looking forward to the kind of Q&A that's a response to this conversation. So thanks again for having me. This is a lot of fun.
Hi, everyone. I thought that was a great session, and very generously 4156 can stay a few minutes now, post the session, and answer some of your questions. 4156, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm here. Good morning. How are you?
Great, great. I am mostly going to stay out of this because I think people want to hear from you. I think some questions will be put here in the chat, in the studio where we are. And what I'd like to ask people to do is also post their questions now in the chat, and then some of the team members will try and feed them up here, and I'll only intervene if we get confused. But otherwise, I think the floor is yours for 156, and there's a couple of, I think, fairly straightforward questions to start with, and we'll see what else we get.
Sure. Sorry. So you want me to read the questions, or you're gonna curate them and read them?
Well, let's start with. I think you can just read them and answer them as you like.
Okay, sure. I see two questions here currently.
Correct, and I'm going to go look for more. I'm going to see what else is out there.
Okay, cool. All right. So I'm just going to read these and talk, I guess. It's kind of hard to get a sense of what the feedback is, but we'll give this a try. Okay, so question, Punk4156, is the revenue of the Nouns DAO shared among the founders in the Gnosis Safe only, or is it also shared with the community? So there is no Gnosis Safe. The Nouns DAO is kind of an instance of the compound governance. So 100% of the auction proceeds when somebody buys a noun flow into the DAO. So the founders actually receive none of that. What the founders do get is every 10th noun for the first 5 years of the project. So if you go and you watch the noun auctions, when you get to noun, 419, you'll notice that noun 420 isn't actually auctioned. It's just sent directly to the founders of the project. And then the auction skips to noun 421. So 100% of the proceeds go into the DAO, 0 to the founders. What the founders get is every 10th noun for the first 5 years. And after that kind of quote unquote Nounders reward is finished. The founders aren't capturing any more sort of value from the project, and 100% of the proceeds go to the DAO. Punk4156, if I have a noun, what are the expected utilities apart from the voting right? Oh, hang on, sorry, this moved. And the potential price upside of the noun NFT I owned. If I only have one noun and I'm not selling, is it only the voting right I get? Yeah, so I think the interesting thing about Nouns is that, probably unlike most other NFT projects, all of the value is created by the community. So in essence, like when you ask the question, what do I get? The answer is really, whatever it is that you're sort of willing to contribute, and the net benefit of all the other the contributions of the other noun owners, and what everyone sort of collectively decides to do with the treasury. In literal terms, what you're getting is you're getting the NFT, and the NFT lets you have one vote, kind of to help direct the treasury. Everything else by design is kind of as open as possible. So this is really sort of bullish on the notion of NFTs as digital originals. So you sort of own the provenance of a real noun and an OG noun, to the extent that you think that token on its own is valuable, independent of any sort of like IP rights or Discord rights or anything else kind of conferred upon you. Most of those things are absent. What is present is the ability to vote, to govern the DAO, and the ownership of the digital original. Okay, I read a while back about Nouns starting a Noun starter project for new Noun-style DAOs to try the experiment, but with more specific goals or orientation. Could you elaborate on that? Yeah, so that project is actually coming from Jacob Horn and Zora. It's called Nouns Builder. I believe it's launching very soon. I think I believe they have a Twitter that you can follow. I'm not running that project or haven't been following it super closely. So Jacob or Nouns Builder would they would be the people to kind of chat with about that. But yeah, I think this idea of sort of like commoditizing the ability to create nounish DAOs is super interesting, and to the extent that we've seen a lot of success with the first instance of the model, I would expect that we'll see success with other instances of the model. And of course, the very interesting thing is like when all of these things are sort of networked in the long run, and able to kind of vote on each other's proposals, call functions on each other. I think that starts to get at that sort of like vision for like a governance layer of the internet or the metaverse or whatever you want to call it in the long run. I think that's going to be super interesting. Question: can you show how you analyze a project? I guess that's with respect to like just discovering other NFT projects and like thinking about are they valuable or not. I mean, I guess I can talk more generally about this. And by the way, if someone is out there with feedback as to like which of these questions they want more time spent on, just let me know. I feel like I'm just kind of talking into the void here, which I'm okay with, but as long as this is interesting. Can you show how you analyze a project? Right. So, I mean, I think maybe the way I think about things is after a lot of years kind of investing in financial markets, like I think there are just kind of typically some signs that you can look for that something of value is being created. And I think this stuff is sort of generalizable between traditional financial markets, NFT projects, sort of like venture capital. I mean, in general, I would say that like one of the things that I use before committing capital or time to something is like, am I obsessed with it? I typically, I'm like very selective about things I invest in, and those things are typically also things that I'm willing to spend a lot of time on personally. So I don't know, like just as an example, like way back, I guess several years ago now, when I invested in Tesla early on, I like had become obsessed with the company. I sat in my friend's Tesla. I was like, this is like being in a rocket ship. I eventually bought one, and like there's like a deep understanding that comes from that sort of obsession. That was true with Bitcoin and Ethereum, and true for NFTs as well. So I think personally, it's less about like, kind of scouring the internet for like something that you think nobody else has discovered yet, and it's more about kind of bouncing around online until you find something that you become obsessed with, and then you can eventually you'll find natural ways to monetize it if you become obsessed with it, and sometimes those things won't necessarily even be investable. Like if you're like obsessed with stable diffusion right now, like maybe you could build a business around it, for example. So I think it's really about being sort of selective, and then about committing your time and your capital to things that kind of pique your interest and where you see an awful lot of depth versus just hanging out and looking for the next Bored Apes and throwing like 5% of your portfolio at each one of these. Do you think it's a good idea to use the Nouns governance model, but for something unrelated to nouns, generative art, everyday forever, where that treasury is used to acquire generative art. Yeah, I think so. And maybe I just won't spend a ton of time on this one because as it relates to the 6529 question above, I think we're about to see what happens when you sort of like generalize this infrastructure and you start forming communities with different kinds of objectives. I would add to that, like, one of the really interesting things about the original instance of nouns is sort of that it doesn't have an objective, that like the objective is sort of driven primarily by the art and the meme and the feeling of the community. So like that the objective is an emergent property. I'm not sure, like, I think it will be interesting to see how it works when, the objective is kind of more explicitly stated at the outset. And of course, I think we're going to see a mix of these nounish DAOs with explicit and then sort of emergent objectives. Okay, next question. You currently have a treasury of approximately 30,000 ETH accrued for more than a year. What are your short and long-term plans for the funds? Again, I do sort of think of the DAO as a function that, based on the kind of interests of like the places where the interests of the DAO members overlap, that's kind of what the funds will be allocated for. As for sort of my own opinion, I do think there's a sense in which like the treasury is kind of misunderstood. Like you hear a lot of people kind of that don't know much about the project, talk about how the funds haven't been used yet, and that's like some sort of like horrible misallocation, or like they've been squandered, or this sort of like kind of nonsense. I think, I do think there's a sense in which the treasury is the sort of like it's like the Federal Reserve of the nouns, right? Like the reserve assets aren't necessarily there to be spent immediately. What they're there for is to kind of reinforce the caliber or the quality or the long-term nature, or the credibility of the protocol. And I think, yes, like proposals passed that sort of disperse a certain percentage of those funds every month or every year. But I think there's actually a lot of value, especially sort of early on in the history of this thing, to being pretty conservative with how the funds are used, to use them in ways that kind of run experiments and sort of further the mission of the protocol. But really, I think there's a lot of value from the treasury just like sitting there as a sort of meme and as a sort of gold reserves of the nouns ecosystem. And so in that sense, I think, like it's more of a question of like, what should we do with the treasury in 10 years when it's, in ETH terms, 10x larger, and in fiat terms, maybe 100 or 1,000x larger. What are the things that we could do at that point? That seems like the most interesting question to me. Okay, question. Seemed like small contradiction between royalties view, artist control, long tail of supply, versus provenance value, early tokens matter more than trad art. Can you try to reconcile these? Okay, hang on, let me think about this for a second. Oh, I see. Like, so it's like, how should artists kind of like monetize their early work if that's the most valuable stuff? Yeah, I mean, I guess that's an interesting point. Like, I mean, I would just say I think there's a lot of uncertainty kind of in both those perspectives. So it's kind of difficult to comment on like what should artists do in case they overlap. But I mean, it is a valid point. Like if most of the value kind of comes from early tokens, how do artists sort of monetize those? I mean, I would say it's less about like an individual artist's early tokens and more about like the early tokens of the NFT space. I think kind of outside of those, very early pieces, that like were minted in 2018, 2019, etc. Like I think as you sort of move away from that era, it does become more kind of analogous to traditional art, where it's about the value of the individual piece versus like the historic value of the token. What is the best strategy for nouns in terms of fast and wide mass adoption in Web 2? I mean, again, I think the best strategy for nouns is the strategy that the community kind of agrees upon, right? The interesting thing about it is that it's kind of like community created content. I will. So one of the things I was sort of kind of alluding to at the end of the conversation with 6529 was the sort of like importance of public goods funding, and kind of like I think I heard somebody call it. I think they called it like warm crypto or warm blockchain. I saw that just one instance of that. But it seems like maybe a useful term. This idea that so here's sort of an example, right? Like if you had right now a kind of like a CO2 negative Bitcoin, right, where like every block that was mined kind of removed CO2 from the atmosphere, right? I mean, you can't do that, but just imagine kind of as a thought experiment that you could, I think you would see like kind of relative to kind of traditional sort of like environmental negative externality Bitcoin, you would see like rapid adoption of that version of Bitcoin, right? Because people sort of would collectively recognize that the adoption is collectively good for the world. And I think that sort of thinking with respect to crypto and blockchains is probably super important, and has been kind of undervalued and underemphasized as a tool for mass adoption. So I do think that the sort of like public goods funding as a method for proliferation and for mass adoption is pretty important, because I think people need to see that this technology can be used for good. And I think, as a kind of community, like the crypto space has really not been great at that, right? Like the world has seen that a handful of people have gotten like absurdly wealthy. The world has seen the huge sort of energy footprint of proof of work, but the world hasn't really seen, and I think up to this point we have not done a great job of sort of like demonstrating the value for people that don't necessarily own these tokens, right? Like what are the positive externalities that these systems can create? So far, they've sort of like hoarded the profits and just it created negative externalities. But I think from here, if we want to see mass adoption, we have to create sort of positive externalities. Hang on one second. Can I drink some water? Perhaps a naive question, but I think I heard that an exchange cannot honor royalties. I presume that royalties were encoded into a smart contract and were always honored. What am I missing? I mean, I think probably like someone with more kind of deep technical expertise about Ethereum can answer this better than me. But effectively, you can always sort of create derivatives and sort of wrapper contracts that allow things to happen on Ethereum. In these kind of meta contracts that don't have to honor the royalties that the original contract has created. It's just like these systems are designed to be sort of like the ultimate free market infrastructure, and so it's very difficult in that context to enforce very specific sorts of constraints. How well audited is your DAO smart contract? Yeah, so I mean, audits are obviously super important in this space. So the actual kind of governance module, the infrastructure, which is that's like the most critical piece of Nouns, is a fork of Compound Governor Bravo, which itself has been used for a long time and undergone significant audits, and then all of the changes that we made to it were audited by some of the best people in the space. The recent kind of V2 of Nouns that was just deployed that improves upon a couple of the governance mechanisms, underwent a code arena audit, and yeah, the sort of technical Nounders themselves, there's a large number of them. They're all kind of very, very elite developers, kind of at the top of the field. So those smart contracts, I would say, are kind of as well scrutinized as sort of any other kind of critical piece of infrastructure in the space. Do you feel there are still talented people willing to build on top of collections as they did following your Nouns tweet, or the talented ones already made it and it's just us plebs left? I think that's actually a really good question, especially the first half of it. If like I created that sort of Nouns tweet today, what would the response be like? And I do think this sort of like speaks a little bit to the value of building and being present in bull markets, right? That like this sort of there's this sort of like wild enthusiasm for trying new things in the context of mania. All of that said, I think we were very lucky when we all got together to build Nouns, that we had a group of people that were not concerned with kind of instantaneous monetization, and really like thinking about building something for the long term. And I think that that sort of outcome is probably much more rare during a bull market. So I think like maybe the answer is twofold. Like on one hand, it's a lot easier to get people together to try new stuff. On the other hand, it's a lot more difficult. And like I think we were pretty lucky with respect to getting people that were willing to build for the long term. Like in kind of measurable terms, that group of people probably could have, we could have, if we wanted to kind of monetize something short term in the midst of that mania, we probably could have made tens of millions of dollars or more by just focusing on that objective. So we all kind of chose to kind of leave a lot of money on the table to try to build something interesting and kind of focused on the long term. And I think it's easier to find people that are willing to do that in a bear market than a bull market, even if it is kind of more difficult to get them all together. Are there specific ways CC0 artists might model their career in Nounish ways other than treasury for proliferation? Are there specific ways CC0 artists might model their career in Nounish ways other than a treasury for proliferation? So I guess if the question is like, what are the ways that CC0 artists can kind of like monetize their work? I think the answer there is like really just native to NFTs. Like, do you believe that selling digital originals it is valuable? I guess if the question is more related to setting up sort of like instances, like new instances of Nouns DAO with Nouns Builder, I think that the model of kind of keeping every nth NFT for yourself, and letting all of the value flow to the treasury is probably difficult for an artist that's starting out, and it's probably like a structure that's more well suited to kind of communities that want to do work together. Question: as the supply of Nouns keeps increasing, is the thesis that newer minted Nouns will become less valuable and the OG Nouns will maintain higher value? So I think certainly that's possible if the sort of like timestamp theory is correct. That said, I do think and it's sort of like difficult to speculate on where the value will come from, because again it is really community driven. But I do think like in the long term, the value is this sort of like combination of provenance, right? Like you belong to the original instance of Nouns, of which there are now hundreds or thousands of sort of like copies of that organization out in the world doing various things, and then also sort of like the membership and community value. What does it mean to have a vote kind of in that protocol? What does it mean to sort of be able to direct that treasury, and to have the sort of like status of being part of that organization? And I do think people kind of frequently look at this idea that the supply is infinite and assume that causes it to trend to zero in the long term. Like one noun every day it's a very, very kind of slow trickle of new supply. It takes about 27 years to get to the market cap of, to get to the number of instances of nouns that are like equivalent to the total supply of punks or bored apes, etc. And if you certainly like look at the kind of like market cap, quote unquote, of those collections, especially, hang on one second. If you look at the sort of like market caps that those collections can support, and sort of compare it to the kind of current market cap of nouns, I think it's pretty clear that the rate of noun production probably doesn't have that much impact on the noun price. The price is probably much more a function of demand than supply. On royalties, and this may be a very naive question, but how can artists who create one-of-ones keep their own work? Right. I mean, we create and sell one. That's very different from an edition or collection. Yeah, I mean, I agreed. And I think that, the royalty stuff, like, to me is it's still like the correct answers there are sort of like much less obvious than CC0, right? Where it's like, there's already kind of good infrastructure and kind of good conventions around kind of solving that problem. Royalties, I think it's probably going to take a lot more kind of experimentation before there's a sort of like consensus model, or maybe there won't ever be a consensus model. Like maybe every artist will kind of do things a little bit differently. I think it's maybe like, to the extent that the thing that artists are monetizing is provenance, right? I think it's probably less about keeping 10% of every piece, and more about monetizing the provenance over the long term, right? So like, as an example, it doesn't really matter for those early X copies if like, there are royalties on them or not, because the amount of money X copy would make from an open edition today, or the amount he made a year ago or whatever, it's like orders of magnitude larger than what the royalty would capture. So I think it's about kind of monetizing the provenance like over your career. I think, yeah, the really tricky thing here that is, I guess, not yet solved, which might be interesting to think about trying to solve, outside of implementing royalties, is like, if you create a bunch of work early on, and then kind of stop creating work, and then that early work becomes very, very valuable, how do you monetize that? That's the very specific case where the royalty makes a lot of sense. But my best guess is that there are like other more kind of like crypto native ways to solve that problem, that kind of don't come with some of the baggage that royalties comes with. I don't know if the question is coherent, but do you see DAOs expand in the future as a possible framework to manage businesses in general? What is preventing this possibility today? Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think probably just like crypto itself, there are some low-hanging fruit. Like, there are some kind of obvious use cases where DAOs make a lot of sense, and like where the advantages of DAOs versus kind of like traditional corporations give them a lot of leverage, and like those are the natural sort of spaces that they're going to occupy for a while. And maybe that's just like Bitcoin and Ether and these sorts of assets as well, right? Which is like they have these like very, very obvious early use cases, but in the long run, we all expect that they will eventually kind of consume everything. And I think the the like DAO as like a concept is kind of like blockchain as a concept, right? Like it's a set of ideas, and like a sort of a set of like abstract rules about how something can work without necessarily being a specific implementation of those things, right? Like, so it seems unlikely to me that like I don't know, like the Nouns framework is the best way to manage a business in general, because it's just very impractical to manage like a business or a startup in a permissionless way where you're like inviting someone new into the business every day, and you can't say whether they should be in or out. Like obviously that's not the correct kind of framework for running a startup. But all of the sort of tools are there to do this in a very efficient way, and people will probably eventually figure out how to engineer them in such a way that when presented with the question of like should I start a sort of like on-chain organization, or should I go and kind of like set up a Delaware C corp, like the answer will always be yes, let's do it on chain. Whether the sort of like decentralized autonomous part of that is intact, I'm not sure, but certainly on-chain organizations will kind of eat everything in the long term, I would expect. That's the end of the questions there. I'm not sure if anyone is out there and still listening, but just let me know if you have more questions or you want to wrap it up. All right. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for the questions, everyone, and hope you have a great day. Thank you, 6529. This has been a lot of fun. Cheers.